Welcome to fuck the number TED Talk. AIM-120 time. Let's go. So, start with familiarization of the AIM-120 itself, what it does, how it do. We'll go over the launch acceptable region, what it means, and how complex that stupid shape is. And then we'll go over into how that is portrayed in our sensors and the dynamic launch zone. We'll go over employment factors and valid shot criteria, and then we're going to finish off with all the brevity and terminology that we use when using these stupid things. So let's go. Big stick. It is an actively radar-guided missile. The AIM-120B uses a boost sustain motor, and it is modeled in DCS sort of like that, so the burn time is longer for it. The AIM-120C has a shorter burn time, and it's a boost-only motor, and it burns for about 7.5, 8 seconds. It will peak out at about Mach 4.0 if you launch it high and fast, very fast. It's got a G limit of 30 Gs. The battery will go on for 80 seconds, which is ultimately the biggest limiting factor of its engagement range. So it can reach out to 40 nautical miles when you're, again, very high, very fast. But you've got to be in very specific parameters to do that. 50-pound blast frag warhead. Kills things pretty dead pretty reliably. So, what makes this thing so good, right? Well, it's an actively guided missile, meaning that it has its own radar on board. However, this does mean that it requires mid-course guidance prior to that activation point. Prior to this, it's considered not in the active state. So, it'll predict the track of the track file you're on based on the radar page, the age setting you set on your bricks, and this is a complete DCS-ism. And I should have said this before I started. We are talking about the AIM-120 as it is simulated in DCS. Do not take this as what it actually does in real life. I will not disclose any of that information. I won't touch any of that information. So don't get any funny ideas.
Hi, China.
Shut up. Yeah, it's a big risk. Anyway, if you lose guidance with an active time greater than the age limit, consider that shot trashed. It is, and we'll go over more trash criteria later, but that's the big thing to remember. Since we've talked about how to set up our radar pages in the previous lessons of always setting a 16-second age limit on the radar attack page, that is going to be our benchmark for whether or not we've lost guidance or whether or not we can provide mid-course guidance with good results. Ultimately, you want to support the missile all the way to the active state, because that gives it more mid-course guidance updates with more refined targeting. If you have to cut that mid-course guidance prior, you're going to get, again, it's just going to predict based on the current like bandit flight path and vector and stuff like that. So if it maneuvers, but it's still like within the age limit, it'll still go to the predicted point of intercept, but it's not as good as if you had been updating that point of intercept through its entire mid-course phase.
Question.
Yes.
Would it make sense for like our meld page to set the age limit to 32 then? Just to avoid that possibility?
That's what we call metagaming, and yeah, that's totally an option you can do. I don't recommend it because the radar page gets cluttered as fuck with hits, and you start like accidentally locking onto those very old bricks. And I hate doing that shit, and it makes for worse employment, so I just set it to 16 because that's the absolute, maximum that I'm willing to put up with. Right. But yeah, you do you, man. Like, it's entirely a thing that you could do. Seeker footprint. This is honestly pretty big. This is like one of the biggest limiting factors of the AIM-120, and it's how you can use it. So the maximum acquisition range for the Seeker down the middle here, that #1 number here, is about 9.5 miles or 18 kilometers. And I'm pulling this straight from the data mine of what it says in game. The field of view for the sensor is 30 degrees across that angle, and it can gimbal 60 degrees either way. So a total field of view is 120 degrees. The thing to remember here is that when it first goes into an active state, that frontal like foveal area is what it's trying to track onto first. So anything that's inside of this cone first is what it's going to latch onto. Doesn't matter if it's friendly, doesn't matter if it's hostile, doesn't matter if it was the wrong sort. That's what it's going to hit, or it's what it's going to start tracking to. We'll go into lanes of fire. Yes. So again, it has no onboard IFF, and it's going to track the first fucking thing that it sees. So be very careful, and that's why I put these numbers down. If there's anything that you see that it's within 10 miles in front of your shot or 5 miles around it, don't shoot. Because especially if there's a friendly in this footprint, don't shoot, because you're probably going to smoke the friendly. If you've got other contacts within that like footprint, you're probably going to have a bad sort. And a bad sort is incredibly common with the missile the way it works right now. So be mindful of these things. Tightly packed groups pose a serious problem for sorting. So, launch acceptable region.
I have a question, Flatline.
Yes.
How do I stop my missile from sorting incorrectly?
Well, that's a really good question. There's a couple of ways you can get around that, I guess. One, you try and generate more separation between the shots, so that, like, let's say you're sorting onto this very tightly packed in group here, right? So you'll try and sort it out so that the first missile will go active and start forcing one of these two to start defending like 5 or 10 seconds before the other missile goes active, or even more time before that, just so that like one target's maneuvering and the other isn't. And because the missile's going to try and go to that predicted point of intercept that we talked about before. So if you give it more time and you put something that is still kind of in that area where it's predicting to intercept, that's how you can get it to sort onto a tighter packed group. The other option is, you just keep shooting more missiles until one of them guides onto the thing you want to, but that's a really inefficient way to do it. Or you just don't shoot 2 missiles into a tightly packed group, and you accept that one of them is going to be untargeted. And that's also a very bad answer.
And the final option would just be to keep your radar on the target.
Yeah, that too. I mean, you're expected to. That's what melding's about.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between, supporting and not supporting. So the picture you've got here is kind of a good example of a missile just doing its own thing. Like, we've turned cold at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have not turned cold and you still have a lock, then you will help the missile be better here.
Right, yes. So, like we talked about in... God damn it. Here, right? So, supporting that missile to its active state is what's going to keep updating that point of intercept. So, if you notice that, like, the first missile starts, if one of those starts to maneuver all kinds of wild and wacky, but you're updating the intercept point before it goes active, then you're helping it along. But once that missile goes active, all bets are off. Whatever it sees first is what it's going to get. So, yeah, supporting it to timeout, well, supporting it to active is about the best you can do. That's the best that you can possibly do. And sometimes it's not good enough. Right, so LAR, Launch Acceptable Region. I'm not going to lie to you. The definitions that ED uses in the game, I am not completely 100% certain of. So I'm going to give you my jackass fucking like guesstimations of what these ranges actually mean and what we've observed in the game. So our arrow is probably the most useless range that you can talk about ever. And that's the maximum aerodynamic range. And you should think of this as directly linked to your aircraft, the launch platform, because that's what it's getting that aerodynamic range off of. And it's essentially the range at which the missile will stall out and have 0 energy. It's the longest possible distance that you could like just fling it over to, and it can't really do anything at that point. Rmax should be considered, and we'll get into this in the next slide, but it's centered around the bandit itself. It's referenced to the bandit, and it's the maximum range at which you can expect the missile to have the energy to make an intercept, assuming that no parameters change, meaning that your flight path and the bandit's flight path stay exactly the same throughout the entire intercept. So it's a very, very optimistic range. However, it's still useful because it still assumes that there is some maneuvering capability in the missile when it makes that intercept point. So it's not a completely wasted shot. R no escape, or RNE, is probably your best kinematic opportunity shot because it assumes that the missile will be able to make an intercept even if the bandit makes a 5-6G slice away from you and tries to run away. Now, that's the only assumption that it makes. It doesn't assume that it will also maneuver or drop countermeasures or anything like that. It's a purely kinematic estimation. And again, it is relative to the hostile. Rmin is the absolute minimum range that you can employ the weapon, and that's in DCS it's essentially fucking zero, because it's the range between how long it takes for the missile to get off your rail, have enough time to maneuver, and have enough maneuver capability to make the intercept point. In real life, we're talking about seeker infusing minimums and shit like that.
It's the break X when you're dogfighting.
Yeah, that's essentially it. Any other questions on these definitions? No? Okay, cool. Fantastic. So, LAR Dynamics is, again, it's a really dynamic shape that we're talking about here. It's a three-dimensional volume of space around the hostile aircraft, and I know you're about to fucking jump on me easy, that is determined by the relationship between the bandit's aspect, the bandit's altitude, the bandit's airspeed, along with your altitude, your aspect of the bandit, and did I already say airspeed? Altitude, aspect, airspeed, those three. So, again, and it will vary between weapon to weapon and with those three things that I talked about earlier. So, the thing to remember is that the launch acceptable region is the largest in the forward quarter, with 0 target aspect, and target aspect is the angle between the bandit's flight path and you. So that angle there. It's largest at higher speed and high altitude for two reasons. You for higher speed, it's because you're not only giving the missile more energy, you're also increasing the rate of closure between you and the bandit, or the missile and the bandit. And that is something that is desirable for the missile because it reduces the time of flight. Higher closure, less time of flight, less time for the bandit to react. It's ultimately what you're chasing after. High altitude is pretty much self-explanatory. It's because you want to reduce the amount of drag that's imparted on the missile. But it also reduces the maneuvering capability of the bandit potentially because there is less air up there to generate lift, meaning that it can generate less G at any given instant. This is also applicable to you, so be careful. At high altitude, especially the Hornet does not like generating G or lift. The wing is not very conducive to that. At least the Hornet's wing shape. So these are some fancy rules of thumb. Basically, past 10,000 feet, you just add a nautical mile for every 1,000 feet that you gain. It's pretty easy. This is somewhat useful. This kind of helps you gauge how long the missile's going to be in the air. So if I want to make a 35 nautical mile shot, that shot is going to be in the air about like 15 to 20 seconds-ish. No, what am I saying? It's going to be in the air almost 60 seconds. I'm dumb. I can't even read my own fucking tables. But again, you're assuming these conditions, and these are pretty conservative conditions. that they're nose on to you, that they're co-altitude, and their co-speed. This is pretty important because this limits the closure velocity that we're talking about. This less useful, this more useful. I do this because I'm a nerd. So, how do you interpret all this crap while you're actually in the seat, right? How do we display this weird geometric shape that changes all the time to you, the fighter in the seat? Well, you do it with these displays. First off is your HUD. Honestly, probably one of the most underused displays ever, because it's really fucking great. So you got your big old circle right here, right? That's your allowable steering error circle. And right now it's kind of useless because the steering dot doesn't actually do what it's supposed to. But I'll bitch about that later. Always at the 12 o'clock position is R-min, so the minimum range. Number 3, these, it says normalized in range display, but it really isn't normalized at all. These fucking shift around. But this first arrow coming off R-min is R no escape. The next one is R max, and right at the bottom you see that diamond is R arrow. And under that, well, that inside tick mark that you see right here, that is the current range relative to the rest of these fucking markings here. And at the bottom here, that little arrow sticking out that's overlapping with R arrow is the aspect Q. So pointing down to the bottom means it's 0 aspect. And you can gauge target aspect pretty accurately just using this circle here, also known as the nerd circle. Your steering dot and HAFU are unfortunately typically superimposed because the goddamn steering dot doesn't actually give you proper steering information. And maybe one day if I bitch about it enough, ED will fix it. Over here on this side of the HUD, you've got your range and closure data block. It also tells you what sensor you're using to get ranging and closure information for. So if you have a correlated track, this I want to say it still says radar, but you'll see correlated under the HAFU. So it'll take both the angle information that the FLIR is getting and the range information that the radar is generating. And this guy right here. So this is, again, probably one of the most important things you can look at during an engagement is your time to active state, or your APOL. Right now it's saying that if I shot right now, or whatever missile I have in the air already, it's going to take 7 seconds to go into the active state. So that's where you can see that. Once that ACT goes away and it's just a number, that's time to impact, or TTI. That's what it shows in the attack radar page.
Question.
Yes.
So the previous slide, your rules of thumb, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got your R max in LAR 20 nautical miles at flight level 200.
Mm-hmm.
And that, okay, so the estimate, that's based on the speed of about 0.9 Mach, I guess?
Yeah. Again, you're going 0.9 Mach, he's going 0.9
They're
Mach.
going 0.9 Mach.
Yep, you're
okay,
both co-altitude, co-speed.
Because the other slide with the HUD looks like our max is quite a ways off of.
Oh, okay. Don't read too much into that. I did this in an active pause state to just like get the symbology up. This is not a good representation of what it will look like in a combat situation.
Okay.
Don't read too much into it. But also you can sort of see that closure velocity impacts this a lot. A lot.
Right. It's about half of what, well, what would you, so they're probably going co-speed with you at 0.8 then?
I think they were like at 0.7 or some shit like that.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So you can launch in a couple of different ways, right? And we'll go over what the symbology is here. So don't ever press this button while you got a missile in the air. That's bad juju. This button's okay. That's okay to do. So when you click Twiz while you're in an STT, It's actually going to put you into TWIS with automatic tracking, which is kind of useful. However, since you've already put the target in STT, they know exactly where you are and what you intend to do, and that there's probably a missile on the way. So it's kind of a lost cause at that point. Your beam scan line, that's always nice to have around. Your launch and steer HAFU, which is like, hey, this is the thing that you're guiding on. That first mark down that line is RMAX. The next one down is RNE, and that right there, that triangle with 23 TTA, is the missile flyout queue and time to active state. So it's going to take 23 seconds for this missile to go active on this guy. And all the way at the bottom, that little hash mark is RMIN. This is not a good example of how to launch in LAR. This clearly was done outside of RMAX. You don't do that. This is just to demonstrate all the symbology that will go up on the attack radar page. So when you're launching in single target track, it is, again, preferred that you maintain that lock until it goes into an active state. If you lose the active state prior to 16 seconds, consider it trashed. If you lose the lock after or with less than 16 seconds, consider it a cheap shot. And we'll go over what that is in a second. TWIS is the preferred method to employ the AIM-120. There's very few reasons not to, other than, you know, you don't, maybe you do want to alert them that you're shooting them because you want them to immediately maneuver. But for the most part, TWIS increases probability of kill because it, at least when we're dealing with the AI, it reduces their ability to react to the shot until it's in the active state. Because the AI is dumb even on excellent, raise, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not going to go through what all this crap is because we covered this in the previous lessons. I don't know why I did this, but I did this. So that's what it looks like once you've fired your shot, right? You're going to get the same missile flyout queue and the same time to active nonsense going on down here. This is a proper in-LAR shot. So it shows that you wait until after the bandit is crossed RMAX and then you shoot. Dual target track is kind of funny. It works within TWIS, so you'll have to be in TWIS to do this. And what you're going to do is you're going to designate a DT1 and DT2. And all that really means is that you're going to put your cursor over one of them, you're going to TDC to press, and that's going to create the launch and steer. And then you're going to go over another HAFU, so let's say I wanted to dual target track on this guy over here. I would just place my cursor over him and depress again, and then this guy's going to have a diamond in the middle of it, and the first guy I locked up is going to have a star in the middle of it. The star is DT1, the diamond is DT2. And if you depress the nose wheel steering button, or the undesignate button, it will swap between DT1 and DT2, which one is launch and steer. So let's say I had this guy locked up right as my DT2. If I press the undesignate button with both of those selected, it's going to switch to this guy over here being DT1 and this guy down here being DT2. And the way to get out of that is to press the reset button. It's going to drop all the track files that you currently have selected and start rebuilding them. The important thing to know is when you're employing in a dual target track, and especially in this group right here, remember how we talked about the secret footprint? This is where it comes into play. Because it's such a tightly packed in group, the odds of it properly sorting are really, really low, even if you support the missile all the way to timeout. And I can prove this to you because I took a attack view file of this after the shots. So you still want to keep supporting the missile until the active state. But the odds of it sorting properly are typically pretty fucking trash. Any questions on dual target track? Fantastic. Okay, so what can we do to make sure that this missile goes where it's supposed to go, right? Well, we can control our own altitude, our own airspeed, and the employment range of the missile. Those three are probably the biggest, most immediate factors when making the missile more successful. The higher we are, the faster we are, the more closure velocity we generate, the better odds and the less time the missile is in the air, which makes it more effective. There's one thing I neglected to put up here, which is just me talking out of my ass, but trust, right? So you want to employ as close to 0 TA as possible, as close to nose on as possible, for two reasons. One, like we talked about, with generating as much closure as possible, as fast as possible. The second reason you want to do this is because it makes the bandit have to turn more, have to turn the maximum amount of degrees to turn to enter a defensive state. So if I launch from square in his face, he has to turn 90 degrees, a full 90 degrees to be in a defensive state, versus here, where he's already like flanking me. He's only got to turn about 30 to 40 degrees to be beaming the missile. It's less energy and less time he has to take to enter that defensive state, and it's less. You got less downrange travel, so less closure. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. The other thing we control is, again, what radar mode we're employing in. So TWIS, STT, or visual. Typically don't want to employ in visual because you have zero control over where that missile's going, and the missile's just going active right off the rail. It doesn't do any lofting. It makes its life as difficult as possible to get a proper pursuit curve on whatever it's guiding on. The other thing we can do is we can impact the lead and loft angle that we're giving the missile at launch. A 15-degree nose-up loft is honestly pretty good when you're up at altitude. It definitely gives the missile like an extra 0.5 Mach on the terminal phase, which is useful because, again, generating more closure. So what can the bandit do to make our life difficult? Well, they still control where they're going, right? They ultimately dictate where their flight path is, and that affects target aspect, which ultimately affects closure, like we keep talking about. They can also employ countermeasures, either expendables or electronic countermeasures, and when they employ these, they can deny our when they employ countermeasures, they deny range information first off, which forces us to employ in home on jam. And that will ultimately deny us our first opportunity to launch in LAR. And they also control their own altitude, which again will affect where we get into launch acceptable region. So in this case, our missile's defeated by countermeasures after the bandit changes their flight path, employs ECM, and drops expendables. So what can we do to defeat that? Well, we shoot more missiles, essentially. There's a couple of considerations when taking these PK enhancing shots. First off, is the kill desired or required? And that will mostly depend on what you're defending, right? If you're defending yourself, sometimes the kill is desired more than it is required. Sometimes you are the strike asset that needs to be protected, so it becomes required. The other question you should ask is there another missile already in the air? If that initial RMAX shot was already defeated, or if you have good reason to believe it was defeated, it might be pertinent to put another shot downrange. The thing to consider, though, is that if you are already in the crank and the range is collapsing closer and closer, and you're past that like minimum abort range or minimum defense range, and you don't have nose on to them, but they have nose on to you, you can expect that they're going to shoot first. So consider that too. If you've got the initiative here with nose authority, it might be worth it to put another shot down range. And is the previous shot trashed, like I'm talking about before? If it was, employ another shot. If not, or if you don't believe it was trashed yet because it didn't lose mid-course and you're not seeing any ECM or anything like that, wait for a timeout and employ again if the kill is required. Wait like 5 seconds ish after 0 time to impact, because it's not completely accurate. Yeah. Use more missiles sometimes. Not all the time. So, shot criteria. How do you know what's a good shot? Well, the shots are going to be considered valid if these conditions are met. 1, you're in LAR and you're in a valid radar mode. That's really all you need for the shot to be valid. And I forgot to put down here supporting the missile at least to the Cheapshot state. That's what I was forgetting. But anyway, be in LAR, be in a proper radar mode, and support the missile until at the least 16 seconds time to active. Otherwise, support it until it's active. Your shot will be invalid or trashed if you shot it outside of RMAX, a lost Q appears in an invalid radar mode, which the only invalid radar mode for us is LTWIS and RWS, or you lose the track with greater than 16 seconds time to active. Cool. Now we move on to a long slog of brevity. Oh, shit. I didn't remove that. Oh well. We're not going to talk about kill. Fox 3. This is basic call that you're going to call over pry, letting people know that you shot something at your targeted group. That's the big thing. If you make this call, it's because you should have already called targeted on whatever the hell you were trying to shoot, right? So it helps when you call out what group you're targeting, because that makes it easy for AIC or anybody else to know on the net that, hey, this group is being shot at. Multi-ship attacks. If you're employing 2 missiles against 2 separate contacts within a group, I stress this highly, within a group, you're going to call out Fox 3, 2 ship, 3 ship, 4 ship, whatever the hell, how many missiles you employed. And again, it's going to be made over pry. PK enhancing shots will also be called. If for some reason like your first shot is like invalid and you need to put another shot down range, you're going to say it again. Second Fox 3 is the terminology that we'll use. Pitbull. I think we all know what this means. It means the missile has reached an active state and no longer requires support from the launching aircraft. This can be made on auxiliary. AIC doesn't give a fuck, nor should they really care. This is just giving you and your flight the heads up that, hey, we can start turning cold or defending or doing whatever we need to that doesn't require us to support the missile. Timeout. Timeout's the big one. This is one that you should make on pry because AIC needs to know. It's announcing that whatever shot you had downrange, so when you called Fox 3, this is announcing that it has reached its expected point of intercept, meaning that in about 5 seconds, you should either get a splash call or trashed. If you lose radar contact after a timeout, it may indicate a splash. It is not guaranteed a splash. It may just mean that the bandit's in the notch and you can't detect it anymore. But don't assume it's a splash if it's timed out. So here are some examples of timeout calls. So let's say you guys are sorted and you shot on your guy, right? So you're gonna like say your call sign, Spartan 3-1, whatever the fuck, timeout Westman. So it's telling AIC, hey, you shot on your sorted guy, and it's timed out on that group, whatever the group label was. This is for a group with only one contact in it. So again, so your call sign, timeout, single only, whatever altitude they were at, single group. You could omit this. I left this in because the text in P825 just has this in there, and it's like, it's good to call out what altitude they're at. Helps build better SA. Now, if you're a fucking real boy and you shot 2 missiles, you're going to call out your call sign, timeout, 2 ship, single group. If you're targeting multiple groups, I don't know how you're doing that, but good on you. But you'll just add in how many timeouts you have. Splash. This assumes that the fighters both tally on the intercept and the bandit has been shot down. So if you see the splash either visually or through your FLIR, call the splash. Hopefully with the group name that was splashed. And again, you make that call and pry. Trashed. We've talked about trashed a lot already. So this indicates that the missile is rendered invalid by bandit maneuver, countermeasures, or own ship radar problems, whatever they may be. And we'll assume trashed if the lost queue occurs, prior to timeout, or not timeout, prior to Pitbull, loss of the track file with greater than 16 seconds to active state, and no splash after time to impact 0 for more than 5 seconds. And you'll make this call and pry. So what this will sound like is like, let's say I shot my missile, I realized I was an L-Twiz, so it's not going to do anything because it's not guiding properly. I'll just call out, Inferno 6-1, shot trashed, skate left, skate right, out cold, whatever the fuck. What I'm doing after that. Yeah. Cheap shot. So a cheap shot is severing the mid-course guidance prior to the active state, but with enough time that it still has that track file in memory. So that's all you're really calling. It kind of has the implication that it's not going to hit, but it's not the worst shot in the world. You probably don't need to make this on pry. It's probably an auxiliary call. Easy. I don't know if you got any input on this one, but again, if you severed the link or you lose radar contact with less than 16 seconds to active state, it's a cheap shot. So right about which net I'm talking about, easy.
This call doesn't matter too much.
Yeah, okay. Sort of figured. It's on Ox. Okay, yeah, that's all I got. Questions, comments, concerns. Here's all my sources if you want to dig through them. P825 is the real deal. Cool.